Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the English with Gemma podcast, your go-to podcast for turning English practice into progress. So today, I think it's the first time that I've ever recorded a podcast and released it at the same time. So I record a podcast, which is audio only, and I put that on Spotify. And I normally do that on Mondays. And then the video of the episode goes onto YouTube on Sundays. However, that did not happen this week. I had my sister visiting me in Alicante, and she and I were very, very busy. So it just didn't happen. I didn't have time to record an episode. So today I'm recording and releasing on the same day. So that's kind of fun, I think. So today we have a really cool topic, and I think this is something that is going to apply to absolutely everyone. We're going to be talking about mastering the skill. Sorry, I was going to say the task, but it's not a task really, it's a skill. The skill of memorization, mastering memorization, and specifically how to remember vocabulary as an ESL learner. So yeah, I think that this is something all of my students kind of complain about, or have issues with, like, how do I remember everything? Because a lot of the time, our English level can be hindered, can be held back by the fact that we just simply can't remember all of the vocab, all of the grammar rules, and all of those types of things. So I'm going to be sharing some tips and tricks on how to memorize better, the science behind memorization, and some specific techniques that apply to language learning. Because obviously, trying to memorize your favorite song lyrics, that kind of just happens automatically. But when you're trying to memorize phrasal verbs or specific vocabulary, that can sometimes be a little bit more challenging. So yeah, let's get into it. We're going to talk about how our memory works, and more importantly, how you can make your memory work better for you. So whether you're a beginner trying to remember basic vocab, or you're an advanced learner and you're just struggling to recall those more complex terms, I'm going to be sharing some practical tips and strategies that you can start using today to improve your memory. So hopefully by the end of this episode, you're going to have kind of like a toolkit of techniques that will help you not only memorize new words, but make them stick in your mind. So grab a notebook if you want to jot down, some of these tips, and let's get started. So in the first section, I'm going to be talking about how memory works very briefly. So before we dive into those more specific memory techniques, I think it's kind of important to understand a little bit about how our memories actually work. So why do I think this is important? I think it's important because when we understand how our brain stores and retrieves information, we can learn to use that process to our advantage. So there are three main stages of memory: encoding, storage, and retrieval. Encoding is the very first step. When you're learning new information, like a new vocab word, your brain is processing that information and then deciding if it's important enough to actually store. So if you're focused and paying attention, the brain will likely encode that information very well. But if you're distracted, or really importantly, you're trying to learn too many new things at once, it might not be encoded properly in your brain. And this is why learning in small chunks is really important. I remember when I was studying to become an English teacher all the way back in 2018, and one of the first very interesting things that I learned in my course and it always stuck with me, was to never teach a student more than 10 new vocab words in each session, in each class, because above 10 words is too much for your brain to actually physically remember. So that's, very important to remember, like trying not to learn too many new things all at the same time, because it's going to mess with this encoding process. So that's encoding. The next step is storage. So after your brain encodes the information, it's stored in your memory, either in your short-term memory or your long-term memory. The challenge is that short-term memory is, well, short, right? So like I just said, you can only hold about 7 to 10 pieces of information in your short-term memory at a time. And it disappears really quickly if it's not reviewed. So if the goal is to move information from short-term memory to long-term memory, that's what we're going to talk about a bit next in a few moments. So the next step in this process is retrieval. So we have encoding, we have storage, and now we're talking about retrieval. This is the part where you actually try to remember what you learned. And this is the part that most people have problems with. You might have experienced those moments where, you've learned something, but you can't quite pull it up to the front of your mind. Maybe you're talking, you're having a great conversation, and then that annoying and frustrating thing happens where you just can't think of the word. You know exactly what you want to say, but you just can't retrieve that word to the front of your memory. So that's a retrieval problem, right? And we've all probably experienced that. But the good news is that there are strategies to make this easier, and we're going to get into those in just a few moments. So what's the key takeaway here? What's the main lesson? The brain needs repetition and focus to move from that short-term memory to long-term memory. And without reviewing or practicing, you're going to forget most of what you learn. Studies have shown that within an hour, people forget up to 50% of new information unless they review it. So by using the right techniques, you can beat this forgetting problem. And that's what I always say to my students. They always say like, oh, I just can't remember anything that I learned in our last lesson. And I tell them, well, are you regularly reviewing? And most of the time, if they're being honest, they'll say, no, I actually haven't been regularly reviewing. So that is key. You need to take 5 to 10 minutes or longer if you can every single day to just have a quick review of your new vocab words. Otherwise, they're just going to go poof right out of your brain, okay? So in our next section, we'll be getting into the memory techniques. Now we have kind of a basic understanding of how memory works, right? Let's get into the fun part and the important part, which is memorization techniques. These are proven and scientifically backed up strategies that will help you memorize new vocab and other important information more easily and effectively. So let's go through 5 powerful techniques that you can start using today. The first one is what I was briefly touching on just a few moments ago, spaced repetition. So, spaced repetition is one of the most effective ways to memorize new information, especially vocabulary. The idea behind spaced repetition is that you review information at increasing intervals. So what that means is instead of cramming, trying to squeeze and fit everything into one study session, you can review it after a day, then after a few days, a week, and so on. There are loads of apps that can actually help you with this, like Anki, Anki, or Quizlet, Quizlet, Anki and Quizlet. So these apps use spaced repetition and algorithms that help you review vocabulary at the right time. But if the apps aren't for you, you can also do this on your own. For example, if you learn 10 new words today, review them tomorrow. Don't review them right away. Review them tomorrow, then in 3 days, then in a week. Each time you review, it strengthens the memory and moves the information deeper into your long-term memory, like what we said before. So you're taking it from your short term and you're moving it into your long term. And the way you're doing this is with those intervals, okay? So you don't need to review everything every single day. This is called spaced repetition because you're creating spaces in between your repetition and memorization sessions. So a real life example could be learning the word umbrella. You look at it today, repeat it tomorrow, and then try to recall it without looking in a couple of days. By the time that you review it in a week, you'll be amazed at how much easier it is to remember. So that's spaced repetition. The next technique is called mnemonics. So mnemonics are little tricks or stories that you create to help you remember something. The idea is to make a mental shortcut that links new information to something that you already know. I loved doing this in school. I loved making up little stories or songs to help me remember things. So for example, let's say you're trying to remember the word chaos, which means complete disorder, disorganization. You can imagine a wild party and everything is chaotic. People are running around, music is blaring super loud, and everything is out of control. That image of a crazy, disorganized party might help you remember the word and the meaning of chaos. The stronger and the more vivid the story or image that you create in your brain, the better your brain is going to remember it. So another example could be trying to remember the word bizarre. Think of something bizarre in real life, like seeing a pink elephant riding a bicycle. The more unusual the association, the better it sticks in your mind. So bizarre means really weird. So if you try to visualize something really bizarre, you are going to create a stronger visual connection with that word and then hopefully memorize it even better. The next technique is visualization. This is kind of similar to mnemonics, but it's more focused on creating mental pictures. And when you learn a new word or concept, you try to picture it in your mind. Visualization works because our brains are wired to process images much more easily than just a word, like an abstract word. You're not going to remember the actual word. You're remembering an image associated with it. So when you think of the word apple, you're probably going to think of the fruit. You're not going to imagine apple, the word in your mind. At least most people. I don't know about you guys, but for me, I'm a very visual learner. So for instance, let's say you're learning the word sunrise. Instead of just repeating the word, close your eyes and imagine a beautiful golden sunrise. Imagine the colors of the sky, the warmth of the sun, and the horizon. Did you like my little mini guided meditation? So by creating this vivid mental image, you're creating a stronger connection to the word itself. If you're learning abstract concepts like success or freedom, you can still visualize what those words mean to you. So of course we have abstract nouns and then we have normal nouns, like things we can picture, and then abstract nouns, which are more just like ideas like love or freedom. But you can still think of an image or a symbol for you that represents love or freedom. So let's say for love, you picture someone that you really love, or you think of a heart or Valentine's Day or something like that. Our next technique is called, sorry, that really scared me. I'm recording in my Airbnb right now and I'm right on the road and a bike just made a really loud noise and it scared me. Whew. Okay, back to the episode. Chunking. I know it sounds kind of funny. This is our technique, chunking. So chunking is another great memory technique, especially when you're trying to learn a lot of information. Instead of trying to, memorize like 20 individual words, you're going to break them up into smaller chunks, smaller pieces, groups. Oh my God, every time. This happens every time. I don't know why, but my brain forgets how to speak. Let me take a moment. Chunking. Maybe if I go into meditation mode, my brain will follow. Let's do this next section in meditation mode. For example, if you're learning kitchen vocabulary, group similar words together. For example, fork, spoon, and knife can be one chunk. Stove, oven, and microwave can be another. Our brains find it much easier to remember information when it's organized into groups or patterns. Did you guys like my meditation voice? Maybe I should do one whole episode where I talk like that the whole time. Or would that be annoying? I don't know. Let me know in the comments. So, with chunking, I think a good tip is to create categories for your vocab words. So, if you're learning travel related words, you might create a chunk like for airport vocabulary. Another chunk would be like hotel vocabulary, and so on. So grouping things together makes it a lot less overwhelming for your brain, and that's going to make it easier to recall later on. Our last technique is practicing retrieval. So this means actively trying to remember what you've learned. Instead of just reviewing it passively, like reading a list, you're going to take it into active learning. So one of the most common mistakes that learners make is simply reading or listening to information without actually testing yourself after. So when you try to recall information from memory, you're strengthening those connections in your brain. So that's great, but how do you actually practice retrieval? Flashcards are great for this. I love flashcards. I always have. Every time I had to study in school, I would get a index card, write, the definition on one side, and then the explanation, and I would always just quiz myself with flashcards. It's not for everybody, but I highly recommend it. Quiz yourself on your vocab words without looking at the answers, then try to recall the meaning of the words or phrases that you've learned. Even if you struggle and find it frustrating at first, the act of just trying to retrieve that is going to help reinforce those connections. So, of course, it doesn't have to be perfect at first, but the longer you spend quizzing yourself and retrieving that information, the easier it's going to be to memorize. So, unfortunately, what you're probably realizing by now is that there's no quick fix or just easy way to memorize vocab. You have to actively do stuff to memorize, right? But it doesn't have to be boring, and it doesn't have to take too much time out of your day-to-day practice. So another way that you could practice retrieval in a classroom setting, if you attend English classes, is by answering questions out loud. If you're learning on your own, you can write everything down that you remember about a topic and then see how much you can recall without looking at your notes. But try to speak out loud, because when we talk out loud, our brain is actually listening. And just the act of saying things out loud, again, is going to reinforce those connections in your brain and make the memorization process faster and more efficient. All right. I think this is our second to last section. How do we apply these techniques? So how do we do this on our own in our day-to-day? Let's walk through a practical example. Imagine you've just learned 10 new words about travel. Let's say passport, destination, itinerary, and so on. Here's how you could use the memory techniques that we've just discussed. Spaced repetition was first. You could review these words the day after learning them, then again in a few days, and then a week later. Visualization was next. For the word destination, imagine a place that you're excited to travel to, and then picture yourself arriving there and then thinking, this is my destination. Mnemonics. Maybe you're trying to remember the word itinerary. You imagine a piece of paper with your day plans written on it, and then the word itinerary pops up in your head. The next technique was chunking. So let's say we group passport, ticket, and visa together as travel documents, and then hotel, check-in, and reservation as hotel vocabulary. And the last technique we discussed was practicing retrieval. So at the end of the day, close your book and try to recall all the words that you learned without looking. If you can remember them, then you're well on your way to mastering that vocab. And if you can't and you get frustrated, that's totally fine, and that's totally normal, and that's part of the process, and that is actually going to help you. Let's talk a little bit now about common mistakes that learners make and how to avoid those mistakes. So, the first mistake that I see everybody making, and I've done it in the past too when I've been studying, is cramming. This is a great vocab word as well, cramming. To cram means to try to fit something into something else, or to try to fit a lot of things into a short amount of time. So, it's tempting to try to learn everything in one session, especially one long study section. But cramming usually leads to poor retention. So your brain needs time. You have to be patient with your brain. It needs time to process and to store information. So remember that spaced repetition is going to be a lot more effective than cramming. The next mistake that people make is over relying on passive learning. So just reading or listening isn't enough. You need to actively engage with your material. So test yourself, write things down, or even explain what you've learned to someone else. And don't be afraid to record yourself too. I know it might sound stupid or it might be kind of embarrassing, but like nobody else is going to hear it. And recording yourself is a really good way to also identify and fix your own mistakes. The last common mistake is not testing yourself. So we've talked about this a lot today, but it's worth repeating, I think. Don't skip self-testing. Trying to recall information on your own is one of the best ways to make sure that it sticks in your brain. So even though that's like the boring part, you don't want to quiz yourself, you probably don't want to spend too much time doing this, it's really important. So we're ready to wrap things up. That's all that I have for you guys today. I would say to summarize, we discussed how memory works. We discussed the importance of techniques like spaced repetition, mnemonics, visualization, chunking, and retrieval practice. And remember that learning and improving your memory isn't just about working harder, it's about working smarter. So, if you guys find this episode helpful, I would love for you to subscribe to the YouTube channel, follow my podcast if you're interested in these kinds of episodes, and leave a review as well. It really, really helps boost my podcast. Leave a comment on YouTube, and as always, if you want to suggest a new topic for me to talk about, I'm always open to suggestions. I would love to hear your feedback on the episodes as well. What else? What else? Don't forget to follow me on all of my social media. Everything is English with Gemma. I've got my Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, Spotify, and I think that's it. And if you're interested in classes with me, I teach online English classes, and everything about those can be found on englishwithgemma.com. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you next week. Mwah. Bye.